In the Canadian city of Halifax, a small ship is moored close to the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. This is Corvette Sackville, and her history can't be separated from the history of the Canadian Navy as it rose during the most difficult years of the 20th century, the time of World War II, starting with the famous Battle of the Atlantic. On September 3, 1939, 2 days after Germany had commenced their invasion of Poland, Great Britain and France declared war against the Nazis' Third Reich. Ten days later, Canada, as a British Dominion, joined the war that historians would later name World War II. At that time, the Canadian Army was small in number, and the Royal Canadian Navy had just 13 warships with 1,819 personnel in total comprising their crews. Their naval forces had to be reinforced before everything else, because the main task for Canada was to sustain Atlantic communications.
In the beginning of the World War II, in the Canadian Navy, they didn't have enough personnel. Where did they get their supply from? The trained officer personnel from the Merchant Navy, the mates and engineers.
I went to sea at the age of 17 and to learn to be an officer, and eventually I would get up there to be a captain, which I did, of course. I was in many convoys crossing the Atlantic.
People donated yachts, and we painted these, some rich man's yacht gray, put a gun on it and a few depth charges, and they had to play the role of escort.
The English remembered the experience of World War I well, when the German submarines came close to blockading the British Isles in 1917 by declaring unrestricted submarine warfare. So, when the smell of gunpowder erupted over Europe again, the Royal Navy applied security measures to their transatlantic communications. Here, a huge role was played by small ships that found their prototype in the form of whaler Southern Pride. Their construction began before the war, and it was exactly these ships that would resurrect a long-forgotten ship type, the Corvette.
Winston Churchill, who had quite a good knowledge of naval history, wanted to bring back the name Corvette, which was a name for a small warship during the 1700s and 1800s. And it was a name that had not been used for many years. They were patterned after Antarctic whaling vessels. And so that hull form was used, but you couldn't call them patrol vessels, whaler type. They needed a proper name, and Corvette was one of those names that was brought out.
So the Royal Navy developed and realized the concept of a small escort ship. They were easy and cheap to build, maneuverable, and had decent seakeeping characteristics, even though the ships provided little comfort for their crews. In Great Britain, they were called Flower-class ships because they were named after flowers, starting with lead ship Gladiolus. In the Canadian Navy, such corvettes were named after the country's cities and settlements.
Sackville was one of 3 corvettes that was built in St. John, New Brunswick. The shipyards on the East Coast were not normally places where they built new ships. But they expected and did repair a lot of war-damaged vessels in Halifax and in St. John. She was the last one to be completed and was commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy on the 28th of December, 1941.
The main performance elements of Flower-class Corvette Sackville in 1942. Standard displacement 950 tons. Length 62.5 meters. Beam 10 meters. Draft 3.5 meters. Armament 102mm Mark 9 gun. Anti-aircraft artillery 2 Lewis .303 caliber twin machine guns. QF 2-pounder Mark 8 pom-pom. Anti-submarine armament 4 Mark II depth charge throwers, 2 depth charge rails with 40 depth charges. Main propulsion: steam engine, 2,750 horsepower. Top cruising speed, 16 knots. Cruising range, 3,500 miles at a 12-knot speed. Crew, 85 people.
There was an initial order of 64 corvettes very early in the war. There were 122 corvettes built in Canada. Some served in the UK, some served in the American Navy and Coast Guard, in fact, as patrol vessels along the American eastern seaboard.
One of the first corvettes going over, and we were sending some of them to Britain. And supposedly it had a wooden pole in place of a gun because, at that time we didn't have spare 4-inch guns. Now, whether it's true or not, but I probably was.
After France capitulated, the Third Reich formed naval bases in the Bay of Biscay. From the second half of 1940, the Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine submarine fleet, Vice Admiral Karl Dönitz, actively used a tactic for counteracting convoy systems called Wolfpacks, which involved attacking a convoy simultaneously with a maximum possible number of submarines under united command. This tactic was used at the beginning of 1942 during Operation Paukenschlag. American historians would later call it the Second Pearl Harbor. The Allies lost more than 60 vessels over the first 3 months of 1942.
So you can see it was devastating along the coast. And as a matter of fact, we had to sail independently from port to port to port. And one day, just to give you some indication how treacherous it was, in the spring of 1942, during the daylight hours in sight of American land, I counted 14 ships laying on the ocean floor, sunk. This is 120, 140 miles. But there they were, parts of the ship, maybe the mast was out of the water, or the funnel, or part of the superstructure, went down stern first, the bow would be out of the water. And the beautiful passenger cargo ship was listing badly, abandoned, and a fire, planes going all over the top of it. So that's what the scenario was like along the American coast in 1942.
And during the day, you had a rangefinder in your hand. You could find out the distance to the next ship. Nighttime, there were no lights at all. So you just keep a good lookout, and you could hear engines, or you could see the ship. Oh, then you'd fall back, call down to engine room to say, reduce speed, we're getting too close to ship ahead. But it could not show a light, not even a cigarette. To say if you had a cigarette light, the U-boats would see it.
Later on, the German Wolfpacks were searching for their targets in the Caribbean Sea, around the Panama Canal, and even in the South Atlantic.
One of my voyages, my very first voyage, as a matter of fact, we were sent from half of the way across the Atlantic down to Brazil. We did not know that Germans had sent U-boats to Brazil, where there were no convoys and very few warships. So they would pick us off, and we were torpedoed off the coast of Brazil. and the ship folded up and went down in 15 minutes. So, but I was lucky to survive and get into a lifeboat.
In the darkest hours of the Battle of the Atlantic, the main protection of sea convoys, primarily in the northern part of the ocean, was provided by these small ships, Sackville and her sister ships.
The Flower-class corvettes were initially thought to be just coastal escorts. And however, as the war went on, it was necessary for them to operate in the open ocean and escort convoys across the Atlantic. They were good seaboats. The corvettes were fine seaboats, but they rolled in any kind of a seaway. They were uncomfortable, but they were safe.
Cheap and nasties was how Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, briefly but aptly named these ships during the war. He was right. Serving on the corvettes wasn't comfortable at all. It was impossible to stop perishable food on board, so sailors lived on preserved food, canned meats and potato powder. Instead of the 50 crew members that the ships were designed to accommodate, 85 personnel served on each corvette. Those who were free from their duties slept on lockers and tables, or in any other dark and slightly warm places. But that was a far cry from the hardest part of their service.
My association with these Flower-class corvettes was, in heavy weather, it was one hell of a ride. They were just up and down like this, you know, eh? I would say they're up in the air like about 40, 50 feet and down again, you know, in heavy weather.
Terrible weather. The weather was one thing in the North Atlantic. It was very much, it was always with us, you could see. And then there was fog as well as rough seas.
As soon as we finished our lookout watch, we just laid down on top of there was some bags of potatoes in a structure on the upper deck, and it was out of the weather, and you just laid down and slept till your next watch, or you tried to sleep.
They would go up and go down between waves. Where is he? Up way! Whoa! Yeah, and of course, they're all seasick down here. A lot of young men, you know, they were not used to the sea.
You know, you felt pretty awful. And then after a few days of that, you begin to tell yourself, I got to get over this because this is only a 3-day trip. What will it be like on a 14-day trip?
The crews of the first corvettes in 1940 were formed of young guys who had entered the naval service because of its romantic and adventurous appeal, but they often hardly knew a thing about life in the Navy. These ships were headed by reservists, officers of merchant ships who had impressive sailing experience but little to no naval experience. Both sailors and officers, after a short drill, had to undertake practical training right in the midst of war.
Tens of thousands of young Canadians from across the country who were recruited into the Navy served in ships just like Sackville. It was their first introduction to going to sea.
Anyway, from there we went to the Azores, and then we joined the convoy going to Ireland. I had my first taste of Guinness Stout. Because I was only a kid, you see. I was probably the youngest lad aboard the ship. You had to be, I think, 19, or 22 to draw rum. And so you'd have a G on your card. But if you were not of that age, you didn't get your grog each day. So anyway, I went to this first time in an Irish pub, and I asked for a glass of Guinness. In those days, they sort of tipped the barrel a bit and opened the spigot, and the thick Guinness sort of slowly slid into the jar or glass. So anyway, that's one of those silly things that you remember.
And these volunteers, but again, they were young and they were in for excitement and they were prepared to put up with the bad conditions. They're all keen, very keen to do their thing in the war.
At that time, the Flower-class ships were nicknamed the Pekingese of the ocean. In ancient China, where this breed originated from, Pekingese dogs, which are similar to tiny lions, were thought to be small guardian spirits. During the entire Battle of the Atlantic, from 1939 to 1945, the Flower-class corvette sank or assisted in destroying 52 German submarines. Losses among the Flower-class ships amounted to 29 corvettes.
These little corvettes were around, supposed to protect us, you know, and attack U-boats. But sometimes they didn't know there was a U-boat present until they torpedoed a ship. Oh my God, bang! Oh, there must be some of the enemies around here. So they had to start listening. And, yeah. But you see, the Germans are very smart. They wait till nighttime, and then at nighttime they bring up the submarine on the surface. So the sonar is not so good when you're on the surface. So then they would pick a ship, pick a tank, an oil tank would go boom, and it'd be massive flames, and all crew would be dead in seconds. So that's how they lit up the whole convoy. I saw a ship going up like that, yeah, and I'll never forget it. You think, oh my God, there's about 40 or 50 guys just gone. Another terrible sight I saw was when a ship carrying iron ore, when she was torpedoed, went right down. No chance to send a message or anything, just right down. Because the ore is so heavy, when the torpedo opens up the side of the ship to a great water pouring in, it just takes the ship right down. That's another bad thing. When ships got torpedoed and the oil tanks were opened up and there was oil all over the place and men were covered in oil. Very bad. Some people didn't survive because the accommodation collapsed and they were stuck inside and they couldn't get out. Oh, yeah.
Sackville also had to join the vicious fights against the wolf packs. It happened in August 1942. The corvette was escorting convoy ON 115 when it was attacked by two submarine wolf packs near the shore of Newfoundland.
I wasn't afraid of submarines because I could not see them. You didn't know they were there until bang!
Then, in August 1942, on her own and without air support due to thick fog, Sackville spotted German submarine U-43 on the surface. Sackville heavily damaged the sub with depth charges when she was in the process of submerging. The next day, the corvette attacked another submarine, U-704, when the latter was submerging for an attack on a convoy. The sub was forced to retreat. After a couple of hours, the corvette detected U-552 with sonar. That sub wasn't able to flee without taking damage. A 4-inch shell from Sackville hit the conning tower of the submarine, and after she had submerged, the corvette dropped a depth charge. The submarine, headed by famous and skilled commander of underwater warfare, Eric Topp, miraculously survived after taking severe damage and managed to return to base. The resolve of Sackville's crew played a crucial part in the convoy losing just 2 out of 41 ships.
These corvettes were here to help us, and if I'd been sunk in a convoy with a corvette, they would come and pick us out the water.
As the war went on, the ships were backfitted with improved equipment. They were fitted with gyro compasses, better sonars, radars. Forecastle, the forecastle, was extended aft to increase the accommodation that was available, and also it made the ships drier and allowed the fitting of more equipment, such as the Hedgehog, which was fitted. However, at the same time, there were a lot of new ships being built, and certainly ships such as the River-class frigates that were built in Canada were basically greatly improved versions of the corvette.
At the beginning of the war, up until 1943, they didn't have such good equipment. Now, later on, they got good equipment. They also had more aircraft cover. They even made some merchant ships into aircraft carriers by putting a deck across the top. U-boats had to keep down. They couldn't sit on the surface and pick us off like that. Boom.
In the first half of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached a breaking point. Qualitative and quantitative growth of the Allied anti-submarine forces resulted in a major reduction of convoy losses. During the next year, in 1944, Germany would lose their bases on the Atlantic coast, and the losses of German submarines would become catastrophic. All these factors resulted in a dramatic cut of the wolf packs. By the middle of 1943, submarines could no longer move so freely in the northern Atlantic.
By the end of the war, we had one of the biggest navies in the world in terms of numbers of ships. So I was very proud of that being just a small, tiny little part of it. But it was good to see when you saw you were in a squadron of Canadian ships, or you run into ships at sea and flashing back and forth to them. It was good to see.
In January 1943, Sackville underwent major repairs. In April, the ship returned to service and continued escorting convoys in the Atlantic Ocean until August 1944. However, the Canadian Navy couldn't complain that they had nothing to do until the very end of the war. During the last days of the war, it was especially honorable to escort ships of the capitulated foe.
German admiral had been instructed by the Allies that all German submarines were to come to the surface, fly a black flag, and proceed to the nearest Allied base. That was the idea of it. The message came telling our squadron commander to take the 5 Canadian ships and intercept. There were 15 German submarines proceeding south, so we closed in on these German submarines, and we sent one of our officers to the senior German officer. So anyway, they obeyed, and we escorted these 15 German U-boats to Loch Eriboll, Scotland. A lot of people had never seen a U-boat, or maybe they saw just a little bit of one, and suddenly 15. And it was pretty rough in the North Sea, so the German conning tower, say half of them would be up and half down and disappear. Then the submarines that were down are up and the other ones are down.
By the end of World War II, the Royal Canadian Navy had more than 1,000 ships of different types, and around 100,000 people out of the 11 million population served on them, almost every 10th Canada citizen. They were great sailors.
They were very good. We respected the Canadian Navy, and the Air Force was good too. They would come out and look over the convoys, look for U-boats. They were very good. Oh, they were great, yeah.
After modernization, Corvette Sackville was remade into a training ship, and she was sent to the reserve when the war ended. In 1952, the ship was converted into a research vessel for the Department of Marine and Fisheries.
She was used for over 40 years after the war as a very useful, cheap and nasty ship to do a whole range of tasks. And for that reason, she was kept and became the very last Flower-class corvette. When she was turned over to the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust in 1983, the plan was to convert her back to her World War II appearance.
Today, Corvette Sackville isn't just a museum ship moored at the pier in Halifax. She is a symbol of bravery of all volunteers of the Royal Canadian Navy, of all those young people who headed into battle on these small ships and made their contribution to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic.
The victory of the Battle of the Atlantic was won by the corvettes, manned by Canadian seamen. That's giving credit where credit is due. They deserve it. Not only that, they earned it. And history will tell you that.